Okay, good morning to you, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are, if you're watching this remotely. This is Monday of the week of the IMF World Bank annual meetings. And many of the people that are in the room, many of the people that are watching online know that this is a week which is a week of intense activity for a lot of the institutions themselves, but also for think tanks and other bodies that are interested in those issues, certainly for the Center for Global Development. For us, it's a busy week, and I'm really happy that this is the first event of that week that we're going to do now. But at the end of this session, we will put up on the screen a picture of all the other events that we're going to be doing this week, the public event, and I hope that some of you will be able to come to that. I should also do a little bit of housekeeping before we start, and I welcome Ilan Goldfajn, which is to remind you that you can live tweet using the hashtag CGD Talks and tagging at CGDev. And also, if you have questions while you're online, you can participate in the conversation, send us those questions. There is a link that you'll be able to send it through on the YouTube chat. Now, having got that out of the way, let me get to this event and say that I can't think of a better event to start the week with than to have Ilan join us, Ilan Goldfajn. Not the first time, of course, that you're at CGD. It's always a pleasure to have you here. And I'm really happy to have Ilan here, not just in his role as the president of the IDB, the Inter-American Development Bank, which, as those of you who follow our MDB reform tracker, which is a document that we put out update every 6 months that shows how different MDBs are moving on their reform agenda that was outlined, will note, and I'm sure Ilan will remind us, that IDB, along with the Asian Development Bank, scores pretty high in terms of having made progress on the reform agenda. But we're welcoming Ilan also today in his role as the chair of the MDB Presidents Group over the past year and running through, if I understand correctly, until the summit, the G20 summit, which is going to happen in a few weeks. So Ilan has had the twin role of sort of getting IDB to make progress, but also to make sure that the MDBs as a group make progress on the agenda that they themselves set out, and there's various documents some of you are familiar with. There is the viewpoint paper that was done. There's a declaration they put out a year ago at Marrakesh. So now the question we're all asking is, this is all great, but how far are we moving? Are we okay with the pace? And that's what I really want to start with. But first of all, Ilan, welcome. Really happy that you're here, and very much looking forward to this conversation. Maybe before we get to where we are, just give us a little bit your take on the past year on the process. You know, you have all these MDBs. They all say they love to work together well, but you know, sometimes you find there's a little gap between intention and actions. How do you feel now about the process of getting them all to come together around this agenda? Any reflections on that?
So, Masood, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I feel like we are starting the week. It's a curtain raiser for the week. You're going to have a busy week. We're going to have a busy week. We're all going to have a busy week. And the MDB reform is an important topic in almost any conversation we have. So I would like to thank what you're doing, what CGD is doing, because it's important. Of course, you mentioned the IDB's tracker and role, and we are very proud of it. So I'm not going to say more about that. I'm going to allow people to look at your report and to find out, but I think it's important. It has been a very intense year at the chair of MDBs, but also a very satisfying year. When we started, there is a culture. It's a different culture. It's a culture where you are looking at the countries. Each MDB has its own system, its own safeguards, its own way to do it, and that's how it has been for decades. The problem now is that we don't have the luxury of going to the countries and imposing on them all these different systems and safeguards. And the reason we don't have the luxury is because we don't have time. You're talking about the pace. We need to do things differently, and we are doing things differently. So for the first time in several years or even decades, we were able to provide a set of concrete deliverables that we call it the viewpoint note, which are basically 16 deliverables where we are going one by one and checking it. The second part of the culture, which is interesting, is that when you come to this job, you look around and say, well, I'm an MDB. I have the knowledge. We have all these very talented people working for us, PhDs. We also have finance, which means that we have the AAA allowed by our composition of the capital and the shareholders. And that means that I have the capacity to provide something that is very scarce for the region. So you say, well, I'm the one providing the scarcity. Probably there will be much more demand than supply. And when you have much more demand than supply, you won't think that you need to compete, right? But when you should go on the ground, MDBs sometimes tend to compete on specific projects. It's like the projects are scarce, and that's a problem because we need to give financing, but we need to provide also the other side, which are the projects, and that's also what we are changing. We are working together to get more done, so it's scale and impact.
And so let's talk a little bit about that, because as you say, historically, each MDB had its processes, it had its own portfolio, it had a pipeline of projects, and now you're trying to work together to develop a project pipeline. You've got notion of country platforms and then using those. How easy has that journey been to get the MDBs, which have well-established history of their own processes, their own board, by the way? I'm not sure there's anybody sitting here from one of the board members' offices, but you know, the boards also sometimes become a little bit possessive about the particular processes and norms they have. How easy has it been to get MDBs and their shareholders to come together on the notion that the only way to scale up is really to think beyond your own systems and join up?
I will say that the call for working together as a system has been heard, and I think there is a call for action coming from the leadership. And this is what allowed us for the first time to have this joint work. For the first time, we had these heads of MDBs, which we usually had always been a group, but this time it's actually became like a, if you like, a G12, whatever, it's 11. We are now a group that really is working. So I think there is this call. Now, it has not been easy because the way we have been working with the countries is in a bilateral way and not really working together. So as you mentioned, there are platforms, and platforms means a lot to a lot of people. Sometimes platforms are just co-financing. Sometimes platforms are, you take a project and you work together the project. But the country project that we want, the country platforms, are one which are more holistic, which means that we will look at a country, we'll look at the sources, we'll look at what is the best strategy, and together with MDBs, but also with other donors, and with the country, work a plan which the country desires, not us. So that's important. Now, we need to make progress, concrete progress. So one thing that I'm very happy is that every month we end up delivering some. So we had just a month or so ago, we published how much climate finance we did. We publish a joint metrics in terms of climate. We are thinking about creating stock taking of nature, not only climate, but also nature. And several of them are happening as we speak.
Right. So I want to go maybe to a particular area of resource mobilization, which is the role that MDBs play in mobilizing private finance. You remember this was part of the agenda that we've set out over the last few years, that the MDBs need to do more themselves, they need to work better together, but they also need to be able to use their capacity and their balance sheet to mobilize more private finance. And actually one of the areas where IDB scores highly in the tracker that we were just talking about is in terms of your kind of focus and commitment on mobilizing private finance. But if you look at the MDB group as a whole, if I remember correctly, I think it's about $70 billion that is the most recent figure of what the MDBs mobilized in terms of private finance. And I think that's kind of about a third of where it needs to be able to meet the vision that was set out. And I want to get a little bit your sense, Ilan, on, do you think that how much of this is like we are stuck in this? If we were to do a fast forward 5 years from now, on the way we work now with the current trajectory, do you think we will actually be able to mobilize much larger volumes of private finance through the MDBs? Or do you think that, this is like fine, but there are so many constraints that 70 might become 100, but don't expect 70 to become 200? So what's your thinking? You know the private sector well from your previous life, so what do you think about this agenda for private sector mobilization?
Well, I think we can get there. I think we are not yet in the pace we need, but I think a lot of different elements are starting to be there. So we all realize that only public sector resources are not enough. I think that's becoming increasingly clear to everybody. There's not an amount of resources from budgets from either the donors, but also not enough debt capacity in the receiving countries. So we know the private sector has a very important role. I think that's becoming clear. We are now, the pace of mobilization is increasing. I can give you some numbers. You mentioned overall savings, which come from the CAF report, and we have been following, CGD has been following this. The latest number is that we are going to get 400 billion in savings over, not mobilization, but savings from our own resources.
You mean ability to lend more?
Yes. Yes.
Oh, but over a decade.
Over a decade.
Yeah, just to be clear.
Yes. But also, one of the key elements of what we're working together is mobilization. On climate finance, which is a report we just published in MDBs, we got 110 billion last year of mobilization on just for climate finance together. You'll say it's not enough, but it's double.
Sure.
Double of the year before. So I'm not going to do a forecast based on 2 points, but it could be exponential or not, but it's getting there. At the IDB, to give you an example, and you mentioned our reforms, we believe the private sector is essential. And that's the reason our capitalization coming from our shareholders is occurring at the IDB Invest. It's a $3.5 billion capitalization that was approved in our annual meeting in March. That will double the size of IDB Invest. Today, IDB Invest and IDB Lab, our private sector arms, represent around 40% of our overall. If you're going to double IDB Invest, I think we're going to become a very private-oriented development MDB. And with 65 years of experience working with the public sector, those two sides, experience with the public sector with a very important private sector is relevant. And let me finish talking about the business model of the IDB Invest. We call it the originate to share. We will still originate the loans, but we will share. We will not keep them on the balance. Let me give you one transaction that we are going to announce this week. And I'm not giving you a lot of details, but it's a transaction that we're going to keep 5% of the loans in our book, and we're going to securitize, we're going to sell the 95%.
Right.
Why is this important? Because the 95% is mobilization. It saves us capital, it allows us to originate more, and we keep skin on the game. People trust us for the origination. They trust us that our safeguards are there, and we can mobilize more. So I do think that we are going the right direction, but the jury is still out whether all of these efforts will get us there.
Right. So you're optimistic about our ability to get there, which is great. I think that's so important for all the reasons that you outlined. What would you say are like the one or two things that are we need to crack to be able to get there? Where you say, look, there's this, either it's a cultural thing or it's a policy thing or it's some sort of traditional thing. What is it that really needs to sort of go beyond or break through to get through? Do you have a sense you've been able to identify one of those?
I think in terms of mobilization, I'll say two things.
Right.
One is that we need to realize that the private sector needs some conditions, some capacity to invest. They need to be able to see that there's some sustainability, either economically, social, rule of law, regulation, everything that's not related to their own business. Because they do know how to evaluate their projects. They do know the risks. They do know return versus risk. But the rule of law, changing regulations, political changes, security, all of this is something that are beyond what we call is not risk, is uncertainty. And this is where I think we, all of us, can try to help providing the conditions. If we are able to do it, then I think there's a big change in terms of policy loans, policy conditions, sustainable countries. These are very important. So this is I think, the number one issue. Number two, I think we need to be able to, in terms of mobilization, we need to be able to provide the right instruments so that we can leverage. Let me give you an example. For decades, currency risk is a major issue for investors. And they will come, I was governor of the Central Bank of Brazil. You can imagine that every week somebody will tell me, why don't you bear the currency risk and let us invest in completely hedge? And I will say, well, this is a market risk. You should take it. It's not for the central bank. And that's the position of all the central banks up to today. What we have done differently this year, and that's my second element, we are now trying to think outside of the box. It's a problem. Let's try to find out a solution. So with Brazil, because Brazil is in the G20, they have the presidency, they are in this energy transition, very important. So we start together and say, how can we help you? So one idea, of course, is, well, help me with the hedging instruments and swaps and options and insurance. Everything is okay. How can we help? We have a better pricing than even the sovereign, because we are AAA. Sometimes the sovereigns don't have the same rating. So we can transfer the prices. But that's very specific of very large countries, large markets. But we devised something different, which is realizing that sometimes the risk or the shock comes when you have a large depreciation, and this is exactly the moment where there's no credit. Because you have a large depreciation, sometimes there's a shock, something not good happened, and there's no market. There's a failure of the market to provide the credit in the moment. And we realize that the currencies tend to come back. So if you give the project and the investors time, things will work out. So that's a scalable product. There was an auction just last week, and we gave some of the credit, And they were able to have from 7 billion reais, which is the seed, they have auctions from the private sector banks of 45 billion, from 7 to 45. So maybe we can get this out of the box thinking and we can leverage. So two elements, policy, stability, and maybe some innovations that can leverage.
That's very helpful. I'm sure people will come back on some of that. What about, I have one other dimension I just want to explore with you, which is, the MDBs have been asked to focus much more over the last few years on cross-border issues, global challenges, climate change, now biodiversity is a lot of focus, pandemic surveillance and prevention. And there's a sort of set of shareholders, and particularly thinking of sort of the rich country shareholders, who have been pushing very hard to say, look, we need to get the MDBs to become much more centrally involved in this agenda. But there's also, you have a regional agenda for your region. The African Development Bank has an agenda for its borrowers, and they're saying, yes, this is all good, but we need to also do this and this. And then there's the World Bank, which of course is a global institution. How do you think about this process of balancing sort of the specific regional needs and priorities with this global agenda? And do you think that balance should be the same for IDB, a regional bank, compared with, say, the World Bank, which is, or do you see a vision going forward where in the MDB system, the system as a whole arrives at a balance, but the individual parts of the system are in different places?
Well, at least from our perspective, we believe that the Latin America Caribbean challenges and opportunities are very much linked to the global challenges. And I think instead of looking at it as a challenge and a difficulty and how can the rich countries versus the developing and all of this blame game, I think it's the opposite. We need to see these challenges as also an opportunities. And I'm not taking it in a very abstract and philosophical way. There's a very clear and concrete way where Latin America and the Caribbean are really part of the solution of the global challenges. I can give you 2 or 3 examples which are very clear. Energy transition. Energy transition. The Latin America has one of the cleanest, already one of the cleanest matrices in terms of transition. And the amount of investment and job creation that is coming from the renewable sector is one of the largest in the world. After China, for example, Brazil is the second largest creation of jobs in the renewable. So why are we only saying, well, this is the global challenge for us, the regional? No. Solving the global challenge is creating jobs. And this is a region where has lost decades exactly on growth and jobs. So this is an opportunity. Oh, we'll say, well, this is just the energy transition. No, not only that. Food security. You have almost 40% of the trade on food coming from the region. So if there's a food security issue globally, solving the food security issues globally also means producing more, exporting more, and having. Third, minerals. Lithium, copper, everything comes from Latin America, Caribbean. Not everything, but a good part of it. So IDB Invest, that we mentioned, is investing in companies that are producing lithium. Green hydrogen. Europe will demand for the next 20 years a huge amount of export of energy because of their challenge. They already signed agreement with Chile. What do? We go to Chile and we provide them a framework. We see how the energy sector will behave in green hydrogen. We'll provide some seed money. We'll provide framework. We provide the knowledge. And we go with Chile into the future to provide us demand that's already there and it's already signed. So green hydrogen, minerals, renewables, food security, they're all very important opportunities. We need to change the narrative that the global challenges are something that are against
Imposed,
developing,
yeah.
are actually an opportunity for all of us to create jobs and to look at the future.
No, I think that's a very much win-win approach, and it'd be interesting to see how much the leaders of individual countries have signed up to that vision, that narrative, because when you go talk to people, you do hear a little bit of this is fine in the general, but for me particularly, there are trade-offs to be addressed. Let me just go one final area, then I want to open it up and then get inputs from people in the room and online. So in the Latin America and Caribbean region, you have middle-income countries, you have countries that are large emerging powers. As you said, Brazil is a very good example, but there are others. But you also have fragile states, some of which are struggling to even deal with sort of basics and not doing so well in terms of catching up. Actually, some of them are going in the other direction.
Yeah.
These are also the ones that are often quite exposed to exogenous shocks and least able to respond to them. And that's the situation in your region, but it's also the same situation you can find in Africa, you can find in South Asia. And so I guess my question to you is, there's been a long discussion about the role of MDBs in working with fragile states where governance is sometimes weaker, institutions are weaker. How do you see the IDB, as an example, tailoring its work to help countries that are going through this kind of challenge at the moment?
I think this is a very key reform, a key issue. Talking about fragile situations, fragile countries is essential because we are here to bring everybody along. So in our region, for example, we are now working very intensely trying to contribute to Haiti, which is a very difficult situation because of the security, but we don't have the luxury of waiting for the ideal conditions. But it means that we need a framework if we're going to engage, for example, in Haiti and others. So we devise a framework, a fragility framework at the bank and say, well, this is how we're going to work in these cases. And the framework helps us. For example, we can, in these cases, work with NGOs or work with the UN and others to be able to deliver our resources. Because sometimes you don't have the governance that exists in less fragile countries. So the framework to be able to work in fragile situations is very important. Number two, we need to define which fragility. So we have middle-income countries, and sometimes you have very fragile subnationals. So you have one part of the country that is very affluent, but the other is very fragile. Shouldn't we work with that part? Just because the average is okay, we should not take into account the fragile situations portions? Yes, we should. And last but not least, we need to define what fragility is. Of course, this leads to poverty, hunger, and others, but also, especially in the Latin American Caribbean, is about security, violence. So we included in our framework, well, if you are in a place where you are not secure, where you have your fragility linked to the violence, the murders, organized crime, and that's where we actually are working separately to include security as one of our priorities, which is not so common to MDBs. But again, out of the box. We need to look and say, well, if this security is something that's preventing investment, is preventing to create jobs, preventing for us to get the poverty out of the country, extreme poverty, we need to deal with it. So we just went to Ecuador, which was one of the countries that invited us to help, and we offer, do you want to launch a regional alliance for security? We did it in a conference, we were there. We already got 12 countries of the region immediately saying, I'm in. And we're going to have a conference in Barbados just in December, beginning of December. We're going to launch this. So I think fragility is very important. The framework is important. The capacity to adapt what is fragility is also very relevant.
And getting into areas which traditionally MDBs have been a little bit hesitant about getting into, a bit reluctant, saying, look, what do we know about this? And is this really something that we can contribute to? So as you say, thinking out of the box.
Yeah, it's important. Yeah. Out of the box for me means taking a little bit more risk and a little bit out of our comfort zone. Yeah. Because staying in the comfort zone will not get us in the right pace to where we want to get.
Well, I'm sure some of the questions we're going to get may take us out of our comfort zone.
At least me.
But before we do that, let me do something that might take you a little bit out of your comfort zone, which is to say, you've sort of talked to us about all the things that are happening, that are generally going well, etc. But if you were to sort of say, okay, here I am, 1 year into this, kind of coming to the tail end of your chairmanship of this group, where do you think we really should push harder? I mean, where do you think that in terms of the agenda, it's the most, not necessarily the most unfinished, but the most behind where you would have hoped it would be, or where you would like the next year or two to focus? What's your, I don't think it's a good idea for people who are leaving jobs to advise their successors, but I do think that you have a view of saying, look, I mean, if I had another year, this is really what I would focus on.
So I always think about the jobs I'm when they're successful. It's not about the past. Right. It's about how much you actually get two things to continue. So for example, the Central Bank of Brazil, all these changes on instant payments and peaks and the tech and the competition in the banking system and the financial inclusion. I was more happy than my successor actually continued that right. than only about what we have done. Here is also the case. I mean, we have very clear, concrete deliverables. Can we continue to do that and check the box over time, continue working on it and reporting? And we're doing it. We actually established a Troika system, which means I'm going to pass it to Carlo yeah. from the European. And I told him, look, I'm not going to disappear. I'm going to be here, and we're going to work together. And maybe we can find out the next one, and we're going to be a Troika. Troika is a system the G20 works on the presidency. So I think it works, and we can do it. But the fact that we have established a lot of first, that was the first time that we had a note. That was the first time that these deliverables were incorporated in the MDB reform framework of the G20. That was the first time that we went with the UN, and the UN has in this, in the Summit of the Future and the Pact of the Future, a lot of the deliverables that we were talking about. So we are getting a lot of the first. We hope that this will get and continue over time.
All right, that's a very diplomatic answer. Now, okay, let's open it up. Let's see, who would like, I think we have a little bit of time, so we can get, so if I do this just to make sure I don't lose out on people, let me just walk around the room this way, if I may. So I'm going to start, I think, Deepak sitting in the second row, then you, then the gentleman in the back, then I'm going to move over to this side. So let's take three at a time. Deepak.
Thank you, Masood. Thank you, Ilan. My name is Deepak Mishra. I represent a think tank in Delhi called Indian Council of Research on International Economic Relations, ICRIER. This was the secretariat for the Larry Summers and N.K. Singh committee that was appointed. The question I have in general is, how much are the developing countries or your beneficiaries are involved in the MDB reform process? And the question I'm asking is because of this following context. We did a global survey of experts on MDBs asking their perception about how MDB reform has progressed in the last 1 year. As you expect, they said it's slow and uneven. But one of the things was we found that the part 2 respondents were more positive on MDB reform than part 1 respondents. So a lot of the finance ministers, policy makers, opinion makers in developing countries seems to have more hope that MDBs are going to reform. So I want to know, because if you believe the borrowing countries know much better about which MDBs which system is better. Let's say environmental sustainable safeguards. Which MDB has the best or most suitable, appropriate safeguard? So involving them would certainly help to accelerate the process of finding the right balance. So I wanted to hear your views on that. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Deepak. Let's take two more. Please, the gentleman in the front, Samuel, and then we'll go to the gentleman in the back here.
Chris McRae, Norman McRae Foundation. I was wondering, do you see AI changing anything? I asked particularly because there was the World Bank ABCDE event, which you co-chaired, and there was quite a lot of discussions of AI changing things where people needed to come together, be it on energy or be it on trying to track down bandits or that.
Very good question, AI, and then in the back. Yep. Thank you.
Hello, Nicola Swan, Swiss Think. We're a small credit consultancy that helps sovereign governments and multilaterals with the rating agencies. And my question is, you mentioned the wish to get the private sector on board, mobilizing capital, including through securitization of loans, if I understood. So some of the rating agencies have warned that in as much as an increasing share of loans are sold on in one form or another to the private sector, in as much as multilaterals do more kind of conduit work than buy and hold work, that this could perhaps put in some question what people call the preferred creditor status, and this is important to the ratings on the multilaterals. So I'm wondering how you think about that risk, how you plan to address that.
Great. So three very good questions. Basically, how do we involve developing countries in the reform process? AI going to change the way we think and do a lot of this work? And how do you manage the risk of originate and distribute in terms of impacting your preferred creditors?
So first of how we involve developing countries, I think we need to be humble that our reform needs to be country-led also. So when we are advocating for something, we need to be able to respond to their needs, and they feel it. They really know when you are actually coming from some magic solution that goes there, or you are actually bringing. So I can give you an example. The platforms we're talking about, they're telling us, don't come with us, all of you together, just land here and say, we have a platform for you, just let us come. So Colombia was saying, well, maybe in Cali now in the COP, Nature COP, we will be able to come to you and ask for. And we're gonna help them do that. Or when I have a currency problem, I'm not telling them what is the solution. They come with says, can you help us with that? So that gives a sense of ownership. And we have learned in other moments where that ownership is essential. So we can do it, we can get them. And the narrative I just mentioned, the narrative of opportunity, the narrative of owning the job creation, that you can insert yourself in a moment where you have a fragmented world, that if you can insert you, it's an opportunity. Because if you go into the blame world, well, the blame game, well, you created the problem, now you're asking me to solve it. It's the global south against global north. It's not going to lead us to the solution fast enough. So that's what I think we need to do. AI. In terms of AI, I think it's a very important technology. We just don't know yet how extensive it is. Has anything new? It's scarce because there are issues of property rights, there are issues of losing jobs. But my take is, well, this is the future. We need also to embrace it, and it can give us a lot. So what we need to do is have a framework or a plan, and we just have a concept note where we want to help countries in 3 dimensions. One, give them the capacity to absorb the technologies. Because the technology could be there, but if you don't know how to deal with it, you're not going to use it. Number 2, you actually need the framework, not the framework, the infrastructure. Right. White bands, all of that. And last, you need to be able to have the friendly regulations for that. So those are our 3 pillars. And if we're going to work, instead of us being afraid of the future, we just embrace it and look at what are the pillars we can help, and those are the three we want to deal. With respect to the mobilization and the original to share and how these rating agencies can see it and what we can do. First, we need to understand what the private sector is looking for. So I mentioned here, they want to stability of things that they don't control. So we need to deal with it. It's difficult. It needs policy. It needs policy loans. It means that our shareholders should be with us, thinking that this is an essential element of what we do. So that's number one. Number two, we need to work with the rating agencies. So we were in Hamburg together, and we had a closed session with the rating agencies, talking exactly about these innovations. So this is what we're doing, how you take this into account, what are the issues, how we're going to work about it. And I think the conversation is evolving, each one doing its role. We cannot forget that the rating agencies they have a role. They have a role of independently assessing risks for investors. But we have a role to think out of the box,
right,
to take more risk and see if we can get there. So, for example, in this securitization deal that I'm talking about, yes, we are holding only 5% and selling it, but as you will see, the rating agencies already rated it, and we are fine. So we can do it. We can do it, but we need to do it in a very responsible way.
And I would just say also, just if I might add a footnote to that, Ilan, which is, I think we tend to think of these things as binary. And in fact, it's a question of volume. I mean, so it depends on how big your balance sheet is and what size of risk you're taking on and what's your intention. I think if you're clear about your intentions and consistent about implementing what you set out, then you provide a lot more assurance to people who are assessing the risk for their investors than if you randomly start throwing out these proposals and then not clear where and how big it's going to be. So clarity of communication is obviously
and transparency of what you're doing. Exactly. So for example, all these GEMS, which is the publication of data of how much we are repaid, how much the preferred credit status actually is reflected in that. We have a joint, one of the deliverables of these MDBs is publishing more, and you're going to see the second round of the GEMS published this month. But also each individual IDB, for example, is publishing more on our data. Right. Why is it important? Because it allows investors to look, well, in these loans, he gets repaid normally X, Y, and Z, or this is where we have better conditions. So transparency is fundamental.
All right, let's take some questions. I will start this side now. I've got one Nancy in the back, and then I think something over there and here. Those three right now. So Nancy, please.
Thank you, Masood, and thank you, Mr. President. It was wonderful to hear from you. I spent many years at the World Bank and then at the IDB, and I'm a big fan. It made me a big fan of the regional banks. So I have two quick questions. I was at the IDB when Enrique Iglesias was the president, and he always resisted too much coordination with the other banks, and particularly with the World Bank in Latin America. He felt that it was better for the countries to be able to let the big banks in Washington, in this case, compete. So I'm just interested in that, in any thoughts you have on that, because the world has changed, and it's very clear from everything you said. But do the countries ever express sort of, why are you guys just getting together and on the platforms and on everything, and we don't really have the same sort of set of choices across the banks? And second, I was late, unfortunately, but if you said anything about Argentina, I apologize. But if you didn't say anything about Argentina right now, anything you want to say would be, I'm sure, very interesting.
Great, thank you. Okay, and then there's the gentleman over there in the middle. Yep.
Thank you for this panel. My name is Pier Naji, and long-standing experience in World Bank Group, and more recently with the European Commission at the European Fund for sustainable development to mobilize, use guarantee, mobilizing private sector. Out of the box, good case, small island states with no fiscal space. The recent transaction in Barbados that actually worked on with a co-guarantee EIB and IDB backed by the European Commission. That's a debt for nature swap financing wastewater treatment plant. What is the room for replication of more of this? And also out of the box, not guaranteeing 90% of the transaction, but having, let's say, the private sector coming with 20% on guarantee on this, or being more at risk. I'll leave it to that.
Great, thank you. And then Mr. Dehejia here.
My name is Mahes K. I appreciate the opportunity to ask a question of you, Mr. President. My question follows on the last one. In fact, there's a study by the OECD that for a 3-year period, 18 to 20, 2018 to 2020, 26% of private capital mobilization to emerging market countries was supported by guarantees. And I actually had the honor to help IDB many years ago construct your guarantee menu when I was advising the bank. Unfortunately, the bank has not used that guarantee structure or the menu as much as it could. And it seems to me that to answer Masood's question about tripling the private sector mobilization, unless you actually leverage up the guarantees, there's no way you're going to do that. So I think that the MEGA guarantees are ineffective, because if you look at the guarantors, there are like 40 different kinds of guarantees, or at least 3 dozen from a dozen institutions. They have to be simple guarantees. What can you do to simplify guarantees so they are really selling the car, not the engine?
All right, okay. So, and then maybe just to close it out, we'll do one more from the lady over here.
You'll have to remind me all.
Yeah, I won't. Don't worry about that. I've got it. Yeah. Yeah.
Hello, hello, there we go, hi. Tracy B, formerly of the IDB and worked with Nancy as well at the same time, and I just wanted to follow up her good question. Is despite all of our attempts at the MDBs from the last couple decades, what I'm finding is sometimes shareholders say one thing at the board and say something very different on the ground. And particularly in terms of having the MDBs on the ground play off each other. So if I don't coordinate, I may get a better deal. And I have seen this all through Latin America, and I'm just wondering if anybody's talking about that at that level. And one thing we thought about, but it never flew, was making sure that we'll only come in if we work with one single country strategy and one single country results frameworks, and basically you divide up the pie. And we had very successful experiences. My first loan, and Nancy, you presided loan committee when I did it, in Brazil, and it was easy peasy to coordinate with the World Bank. But and even in diagnostic work, not so much anymore.
Great, thank you. So, cooperate or compete, you know, that's kind of the first 2 questions there. Argentina, your take on that? More on the innovative financing structures, you know, a la Barbados that you were talking about, and then guarantees, scale them up, simplify. Without that, you know, it's going to be hard to achieve the outcome. So what, you can answer any or all of these, Ilan.
So let me start with compete versus coordinate.
Right.
When you come from the private sector, as I came from, you always, this competition must be always better, no? Because you push the staff to do better projects and get the right project. But then I got the countries, smaller countries. So I was in Jamaica with Ajay in a tour together, and they told us, look, I have the same 2 guys to deal with all of you. You are the World Bank, the European Commission, the EIB, everybody's there, and I mean, it's too much. And I have to go always safeguard. So please, can you just coordinate? So what they're asking us to coordinate is about our safeguards or our procurement regulations. So one of our deliverables is to be able to trust each other. So we have this now 13 agreements of mutual reliance that we have just done this year. So that helps them because they don't need to have all these others. So that's practical issues that the countries are demanding us. In addition, even larger countries, and I was talking about Brazil, they're going to have an event this week. And it's good that we've started because we're always announcing all these events this week. So they're going to talk about how IDB and the World Bank and others can help them in the energy transition goal that they have. They're actually asking us to work together. And that's a big country that could just say, let them compete. And they're not, they're saying. And that actually is maybe changing on the ground the way we are thinking about too in the times of Iglesias, which probably make more sense at that time. But we need to be tuned to the reality and what the countries are actually asking us, because this is what they need at this point. Maybe because the reality is such that we need. There are not more budgets, there are not more resources. They need to be there, and that's how it works. Argentina, I didn't say anything about Argentina before, so I have to answer to you. I always like to think about what is the places where we can contribute, work together in a constructive way. So Argentina has done, in the last several months, a very important fiscal consolidation from minus something, 5% of GDP change on fiscal. And the MDBs, IMF, have been asking Argentina to consolidate the fiscal deficits for years. And they're starting to do it. The question, of course, is it sustainable? Are you doing it efficiently? Are you protecting the most vulnerable? And that's exactly where we come. And we talk to them and say, look, can we help you with them being more efficient in order to be more sustainable? Can we help you design this adjustment so that the most vulnerable suffer less? Can we help you with the private sector? Right. Because the private sector is the one that can generate you growth without more in public indebtedness. So those are the type of things we are working. Help me with the rest.
The innovative project design proposal that you talked about.
Oh, the guarantees.
Yes.
So yes.
Guarantees together in a way.
Yeah, so there are two questions on the guarantees.
Yeah.
So yes, and again, we are lucky to be first. So yes, this week we're going to talk about the debt swap with the EIB, with Barbados, and suddenly the two MDBs, one from Europe, one from Latin America, working with Barbados on guarantees on a debt swap for climate. Actually, not only for climate, but for adaptation. You're working on water resilience, very important. So that's a landmark of what we can do, and we're using guarantees. Can we use all the guarantees from one place? No. That's why we coordinate, because we can get one guarantee, the others. Can we do it with donor money? We hope so. We are looking forward to get that. Can we do it with the private sector? Maybe. We need to get what we call the platforms where everybody's together. And yes, we need to do more in guarantees. So on the reforms, one of the important reforms we are doing at IDB is instrument reforms. How can we use better our instruments? I hope to recover your proposal there. I need to look at it. But that's what we're doing as we speak. And we're gonna publish this week our mission scorecard, where we have all our goals of what we're gonna do. It's not gonna be an abstract. So we're doing the reforms, but we actually have very concrete milestones, which will be our mission scorecard.
Great. Okay. Well, I think that has been super helpful for us to get started for the week. You will see on the screen in the next minute or so a list of the events that we're going to be doing this week. But what I really want to do now is to just thank Ilan for coming and talking so candidly and comprehensively about the work that you've been leading. And I want to thank all of you for being here on the Monday morning. So please join me in thanking Ilan.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Great.